Well, I'm Lee Barrett from Lancaster Theological Seminary. Actually, I was just pointed out to me that the full name is Lancaster Theological Seminary of Moravian University on the Ann B. Barsinger campus. You should see my business card. I bring you greetings from the seminary that has had long ties with Derry Presbyterian. And this is the last in our series on life beyond death, which is an appropriate topic to have as we approach Holy Week with Palm Sunday. Oh, by the way, happy Palm Sunday. Not sure if it's Mary Palm Sunday. We have been talking about different Christian understandings of what happens beyond death, and there have been many, because the Bible has a lot of different voices in it about this matter, a lot of different themes. And those themes evolved through the history of the composition of Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, ranging from the early days in which there wasn't much belief in a life beyond death, to the New Testament, where the resurrection of Jesus provided hope for something, although it's not entirely clear what, because there are two different trajectories from the resurrection of Jesus. One's the empty tomb story, which seems to suggest that the body got up, or was somehow or other resuscitated, or a new spiritual body was created. But anyway, the body wasn't there anymore. So that tends to suggest resurrection of the body. But there's another trajectory of just the resurrection appearances, which don't seem to involve a body that was exactly like or anything like Jesus' previous existence. In fact, the Apostle Paul, in his letters, doesn't mention the empty tomb at all, doesn't mention a physical resurrection. Whenever he's talking about Jesus, it seems to be entirely spiritual and disembodied. And Paul's letters are the oldest thing in the New Testament. Paul's letters were written before the Gospels. And so it's significant that he doesn't mention the empty tomb. So some Christians throughout the centuries have picked up on the resurrection appearances, which seem to be spiritual, and run with that, and downplayed resurrection of the body or negated it entirely. All this has been the spiritual resurrection, not a physical one, but a spiritual one, has gained a lot of popularity in the modern period, from the 17th century on, as folk, starting with Descartes, a French philosopher from the 17th century, stressed the difference between human consciousness and physical events. And Descartes proposed there are two different kinds of things in our lives. One is material reality, physical reality. But the other thing is what goes on in our heads, our consciousness. And Descartes proposed that what goes on in our consciousness cannot be reduced to accounts of physical reality. He did it in a very sophisticated philosophical way, but I think most of us have that kind of sense that there's stuff out there composed of atoms and subatomic particles, and then there's our feelings and our thoughts. And the two kinds of things are very, very different. And then the question becomes, can you have consciousness, thoughts, feelings, without there being a physical basis for it? Can you have consciousness without brain events or brain activity, for example? Is there something about you that can live on even if your brain is dead? And some, even not just Christians, but some philosophers would say, yeah, consciousness and material reality are different. It seems for right now that our consciousness is based on brain states, electromagnetic events in our neurological system. But maybe that's not necessary. We can imagine consciousness without the substratum, the support of the brain states. So some folk have gotten very enthusiastic about spiritual resurrection rather than the resurrection of the body. That we have something that can survive the deterioration of our physical apparatus. Well, that leads to the question, well then, what survives? What is it to have a spiritual existence beyond death? And that's where things get interesting, because the Bible doesn't provide much information about that. What is our spirit, and what might it be doing post-mortem? One view is, I'm going to call it the survival of the virtues. That the good things you've done in life, the loving acts you perform, the acts of kindness, the acts of compassion, the acts of justice, those qualities live on. So that it's not you having new experiences that survives death, it's the loving things you've done that survives death. So that, for example, in this view, let's say Mother Teresa is in eternity feeding the hungry of Calcutta. And Martin Luther King Jr. in eternity is always giving the I Have a Dream speech. And if you've ever done anything loving, that gets taken into eternity and is permanent. It becomes part of the permanent furniture of the universe. Now, this has some interesting implications. If you've done a lot of loving things, then a lot of you survives. A lot of you is taken into eternity. But if you've done not so many loving things, once you gave a quarter to a street person, that makes it into eternity, but that's about it. And if you have been a real louse all your life and never done anything that's compassionate, then there's nothing of you left. You just disappear. So that is, I'll call that the survival of the virtues. Does that appeal to anybody? Or make sense to say, yeah, I think that's probably the way it is. Love never dies. So the parts of me that are loving will survive in eternity. Takers?
Sounds like a scorecard.
Yeah, some people survive their loving acts. They've done more of them, so there's more of them beyond the grave. Those who have done nothing or very little are just forgotten. That's called mortalism. You just disappear. There's no record of you ever having been here. I'm not sure that got much enthusiasm.
Is there a basis for that, or is somebody just thinking that this might be true?
Well, there is a biblical basis for it. It's Jesus in a few different instances says to people that what you have done will live forever. He says that to the woman who anointed his feet. So, this will be remembered, and this will survive in eternity. And on the cross, when one of the thieves that's crucified with him says, this man has done nothing to deserve death, then Jesus says to him, this will be, one translation is, you will be with me in paradise. But the more correct translation is, this will be with me in paradise. What you just said will be with me in paradise. So there is some biblical basis for that. When Jesus does say to people, yeah, that was good. That's going into eternity. Now, admittedly, that's possibly scant evidence. Another view is that eternity is experienced now. Let me backtrack a little. Behind this view is the notion that God is perfect and therefore lives beyond time and space. That God is not limited by our categories of here, there. God is neither up nor down, nor to the east, nor to the west. God's beyond space, has no spatial coordinates, and also no temporal coordinates. God's not yesterday, not now, not tomorrow. God doesn't have seasons. God doesn't get old. God doesn't change. God does not have something that God did on Tuesday and then God does something else on Wednesday. God's the same as God was now, as God was 4 millennia ago. So God exists beyond time. Now, if God exists beyond time and space, and what we are hoping for, blessedness, is being with God, then that means our being with God occurs beyond time and space. So it's not after death, it's beyond death. In fact, it's going on right now. Does that make sense? This is probably the most abstract view, and it's predicated on the notion that time and space are our categories. We live in time and space. God doesn't. So in the sense that we are with God, we would have to be beyond time and space. So eternity it's an atemporal state with no past, present, or future. It's not like, well, I was alive, and then I died, and then I woke up in heaven. Because that suggests temporality, time. Like, 10 o'clock I was alive, at 11 o'clock I died, by noon I was in heaven. That doesn't apply if God lives beyond time and space. And what we are hoping for is to be with God. This view also usually has the corollary that our being with God eternally can sometimes be experienced now. It is a constant state. Like, in this view, you're in heaven right now. May not look like it. You might think you're in Derry Presbyterian, and part of you is, most of you is, but there is the eternal part of you that right now is already enjoying the presence of God, although we usually don't feel it, except at certain special moments when the veil is lifted, the veil of time is lifted, and we feel God's eternal presence. And we feel serene, secure, blessed. We are enjoying intimacy with God. For some people, that might happen during deep meditative states. It might happen during prayer. It might happen during the celebration of the Lord's Supper, when the family of God is gathered together and you receive the bread and the wine, and you have a sense of being united in eternity with all people across the world taking communion, and all people in the past who ever did, and all people in the future who ever will. Union with the great cloud of witnesses. I had one student who felt that very deeply when she went to receive the Lord's Supper, and she'd actually say, I saw dead people gathered around the table. She said, like, who? He said, well, I think some of them were past professors here. I usually say, no, that was me and I'm still here. For some people, it might just happen during any kind of worship. Just going to a worship service when you feel that you're lifted out of time and have a sense of being in the presence of the Eternal One. Does that happen to anybody?
Laying on of the hands during the deacons and elder swearing in, I really got it that way.
Yeah. Special rituals, like an installation, an ordination, laying on of hands, maybe the baptism of a baby, particularly if it's your baby. Can anybody give a testimony to this?
How about being in the mountains? Like
Oh, yeah.
place that looks eternal.
Yeah. Have you ever done that? Like hiked on the Appalachian Trail, or stared at the ocean, or seen the Alps or the Rockies, and it seems like you're lifted out of time. and you're in a different dimension. That happened to me once, well, a few times, but most memorable, because it got me into trouble, was I was on a train, I was living in Denmark at the time, and I was going from Denmark to Rome to have a conference with a group of Roman Catholics in the Vatican called the Congregation for the Preservation of the Faith, which is also known on the streets as the Inquisition. And I've been invited to be at a meeting. I knew I wasn't going to be burned at the stake. So I was supposed to get from Copenhagen to Rome. Fell asleep on the train. Didn't get off in Munich, which is what I should have done to change trains, and ended up in Innsbruck, Austria. Woke up in a panic saying, yeah, gee, I'm supposed to go to the Vatican. And rushed outside to see when the next train to Italy was, and looked out of the window of the train station and saw this lovely medieval town with the Alps behind it and a beautiful river running through it. And I just was mesmerized. I just stood there looking at it and saying, you know, and I was having a transcendent experience. So I forgot entirely about going to Italy. I was beyond time. So I didn't look at the clock. I didn't look at a timetable for when the trains were running. I just stood there and in awe, having a kind of reverie. And then I never made it to Rome. So I never met the Inquisition, never met the Pope, but I had a transcendent experience. Does that sound, many people report having it when they're staring at the ocean, deep in the forest, mountains.
Stars.
Stars,
Yeah.
stars, yeah, yeah. The starry heavens above. Anybody else? Does this sound familiar? So that's called the eternal now. It's happening now, but you're entering eternity. And for those folk who like this, there is also a New Testament warrant. There are times in the Bible when the disciples are with Jesus, and they're thinking he's just a human guy, but suddenly the radiance of the Lord breaks through, and they have a transcendent experience. That happens big time on the story of the Transfiguration, when the disciples go, the three of them go up with Jesus to a mountaintop, and he is transformed before them when he seems to be talking to Moses and Elijah, and he starts to glow, and a cloud comes over them, and they fall down in kind of a stupor. So that's, Jesus' divinity, the eternity broke through. The other big one is, that's coming up for Easter, the story in Luke of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, when they don't know it's Jesus who's walking with them from Jerusalem to Emmaus. They have no clue. But when they sit down to have dinner and he breaks the bread, then his divinity shines through, and they know they were with the Lord, and then he disappears. So that's these are called epiphanies, or theophanies, sudden appearances of the eternal, the infinite, that break through our ordinary experience. And great theologian Paul Tillich called it the eternal now. Eternity happens now. It's a particular kind of experience in which you become oblivious to the passage of time. Still, and a show of hands, for how many people does this just sound nuts? For how many people does this say, I think I've had these experiences? Okay, that's the majority. And the crucial thing is that time does not apply. There are, if you don't like that one, but many of you did, there are other accounts of our spiritual survival beyond death. And some of these might sound a little fanciful. One is you survive by being remembered by God. That God will never forget you. God will never forget your life. And some versions of this, it's God sort of has you on videotape and will rerun your life forever. Kind of like Groundhog's Day. So you will be a rerun for all eternity, which means that your life on earth is important, because what you do now will be preserved in God's memory and constantly replayed. In this view, God just doesn't remember you from the outside, like doesn't just remember what you did as if God were observing it. God remembers you from the inside. God remembers your feelings. So in a way, your feelings, your consciousness, your emotions, your thoughts are reborn in the life of God forever and ever. Now, you might balk at this, saying, I really hope that doesn't happen, because there are things in my life that I don't want to be remembered, that I don't want to relive. You know, please God, edit out junior high. And in some versions of this view, that's what happens. God does edit out the bad stuff, the unpleasant stuff, the betrayals, the animosity, the times you were envious, the times you were violent, the times you were selfish. That those get edited out. Those fall on the editorial floor, so that it's only the worthwhile, the noble, the loving, the compassionate, the just parts of your life that are remembered. Which means some people's life story will be long, and after the editing, some people's life story might be very, very short. Some might just be, you know, there were 5 seconds when you were a decent person. But other folk may have spent years and years of being kind, compassionate, and so all that gets replayed. How many folk are attracted to that view?
You know, is life only the highlights?
Well, in some versions of this, and it's associated with something called process theology, the bad things are remembered, but they're replayed with a resolution. So that, let's say, you're divorced. Your divorce will be replayed, but there will be reconciliation. Is that attractive?
That strikes me as man trying to justify what he did or didn't do. To me, that's a man thing.
Yeah.
By man, you know.
Right.
A human thing.
Right. Yeah.
You know, how about you learn from your mistakes? I mean, a lot of times we make a mistake and we go back and say, this is wrong, can I redo it?
Yeah, that's, or can it be fixed? Yeah. I made a mistake, I wish it hadn't happened, maybe God can fix it. The motivation for this view was they wanted to give importance to the stuff that happens in this life. They wanted to avoid the notion that, well, we live and that doesn't matter all that much on earth, and then we go to heaven and things will be better. They want to say, well, no, heaven is earth replayed, but all the rough edges made smooth, and all the pain purged, and all the animosity and broken relationships healed. So it'll be your life with everything healed. I think people are looking kind of skeptical about this one. Okay, you didn't like that one? Well, we still have some more. One is, and the next one's simple. It does not revolve any kind of bodily resurrection. It is simply a return to an earlier kind of Jewish sensibility that we live on through the impact we've had on people. That you live on, and not just externally. You become, all of us in this view, have become part of a future generation. Or to put it another way, past generations live on in you. Probably the most dramatic would be your parents. You think you're an isolated individual? No. Your parents are in your head. They're not entirely gone. They're living in you. When I was in college, my first year, I was amazed that most of my friends, late at night, when we'd have bull sessions, would talk incessantly about how they had been damaged by their parents. And I said to them, I think this whole thing is kind of whiny, and it's self-indulgent, and for me, I had parents, but this is what I said to my friends, but they really never had much of an impact on me.
So you were clueless.
Yeah, right. They were kind of background noise, I guess they were trying to shape me, but basically, I'm the captain of my own ship, and I'm basically self-created. And I am not the product of my upbringing. My parents really never laid a glove on the formation of my character. I did it all by myself. Looks like you're scoffing.
Yeah.
And then later, much later, I would be doing something like driving on a turnpike, and somebody would cut me off, and I would immediately chase them and cut them off. And then I would realize, I'm not a nice person. And then I would think to myself, oh, that's what Dad would have done. He's living in my head, and he's making me do things. And or I'd say something snippy to somebody and realize, oh, that's what my mother would have said. And realize my father and my mother, they weren't just memories, they were active in my psyche. Their voices were still speaking through me. And that would have an impact on the people I interacted with. So in a way, like let's say a person would cut me off and then I cut them off, then they would become, in the future, even more prone to be vindictive and cut people off. So my father would live on in them, which explains driving in New Jersey. It's all due to my father. So there's a ripple effect that spreads and might get diminished from generation to generation, but it's still there. So all of us live on, for good or ill, in the people who come after us. Everybody you've ever had an impact on, and then everybody they have an impact on. And that was kind of a Jewish sensibility from the middle stages of Hebrew scriptures. Anybody like that one as your favorite so far? Yes, I live on in all the people I've impacted.
Partly true.
It's true.
It's not a
Well,
theory.
it's-
Yeah.
Yeah, that was probably empirically true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see that would be more true in a more agrarian society where the families stay together
Yeah.
than today's family that by the time you're 20-ish, you're here, your parents are here, and everybody's everywhere else. You have less.
Right. So
Less-
nobody has as strong an impact
Yeah.
as they used to,
As they
because
used to.
families used to have an enormous,
Because there was a time when grandfathers or grandparents would
Right.
have more of an influence.
oh, yeah,
And today, if you're lucky, depending where you are, you see them once or twice a year.
right, right. Yeah, so the influences become more diffuse.
I would think so.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of my greater family where I have kids scattered
Yeah.
and grandkids scattered even
Well,
further.
I'm sure that's true. So even if people have an impact, it's lessened than it used to be. Because there are more, because we are no longer embedded in extended families or even nuclear families, we get influenced by 1,000 different people. So anybody's impact is reduced.
But by the same token, I think the nature of family has changed. I think Bill's right. I grew up in very much that definition of very tight family where it was a daily contact. But then as our kids have gone off into their own worlds, they have these nuclear groups, and those nuclear groups have that impact on them. So yeah, it's not bloodline anymore, but we all form these chosen families, and those chosen families have that same impact that our blood families used to.
Yeah. Well, and that's probably sociologically true. And that was epitomized in the 1990s by the shift in sitcoms on TV. Earlier sitcoms were about families. You know, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best. In the 90s, and it's still continuing, the focus of sitcoms became affinity groups that were voluntary, like Cheers. You know, it's not about family, it's about people hanging out in a bar.
Yeah.
Or Friends, which was not about bloodline, or the variety of shows that occurred in offices, like The Office, or in hospitals. So the new primary social group became voluntary associations of friends or colleagues at work. And that seemed to be much more important to people than their biological family.
Lee, I noticed that family shows that were on later, the earlier ones, mom and dad were all knowing, and the later ones, mom and dad were pretty stupid.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, and that started in the 70s with All in the Family.
Mm.
You know, with Archie Bunker, who's sort of the patriarch, is bumbling, bigoted, and good-hearted usually, but stupid. Yeah, and that kind of continued. So there is this a resurgence of you live on in those you have impacted and affected, and maybe even not just folk you're intimate with, but like doctors live on in their patients, lawyers live on in their clients. Business persons live on in the consumers who buy their products. But in all instances, it's something you survive on earth because of your earthly impact. Now there are some others, or there's one other big one. Maybe upon death, our consciousness, our soul, our spirit, whatever you want to call it, is absorbed by God. We came from God, like a raindrop from the cloud. And then we exist on earth for a while, and then we evaporate back into the cloud. We came from God, and we return to God. Now, that does not involve the survival of consciousness. As one person who espoused this view said, well, if that's true, if we go back to God and we're absorbed by God, what's that feel like? And his answer was, feels pretty much like it did before you were born. You know, it does not involve self-consciousness. So think about before you were born. I was traumatized when I discovered that there was a time when I did not exist. I was like 4 or 5, and my father was talking about World War II. And I said, I don't remember that. And he said, that's because you weren't born yet. And I said, where was I? And he just said, you were nowhere. And then I was really depressed because I thought, a lot of interesting stuff happened that I missed. and that just seemed wrong. But that's the view that going back to God will probably be like the state before you were born. So your energy is not lost. Your energy is still up there in the cloud. It sounds like a technological phenomenon. So it's not as if you just disappear. It's just that your consciousness is gone and you become part of all things.
Boy, this is very muddy, but aside from this one and the eternal now, is the prevailing Christian viewpoint that somehow your essence snaps into being when you're created and there's nothing before, or what?
Yeah, that has been that's the dominant Christian view. That you just weren't here. There's no soul, no spirit before you were born. That your spirit or soul, whatever you want to call it, was created and birthed along with your body. There was an alternative view called the pre-existence of the soul, that maybe our souls are eternal. They'd always been there, we just don't remember it. And in that view was developed by a 3rd century theologian named Origen, who said that to his students, it's like this. All our souls were always in existence, and all our souls were always in paradise with God. And what God was doing was lecturing about the structure of the universe. But there were windows in paradise, and students got bored with God's lecture, and they started to look out the window at the universe down there with nature and trees, and God knew they were beginning to fantasize about being down there. And so God said, okay, you folks aren't paying attention, you're bored, so you just go down there and see how you like it. And so God kicked everybody out of heaven, put them on earth, and then the souls finally learned that this is pretty miserable down here, and longed to go back to the heavenly lecture. And God said, well, if you're genuinely tired of being down on earth and getting hungry and having physical pains and having tragedies, and you really don't like it anymore, then I will let you back in at the point of death. And this time they'll come back and say, thank God we can listen to the lecture. And this time I'm going to pay attention because I don't want to get kicked out again, because it's really bad down there. But generally, the view has been our souls are created by God at a specific point in time. So how, what do you think of the absorption into God view?
I like
Any takers?
It's not bad. It's not bad.
Michelangelo, the great architect, painter, sculptor, evidently said when he was dying that I am returning to God, to the source of my creativity.
Cool. There's a metaphorical jump here. Back in the day when I was growing up, there was a program called Mission Impossible, and part of its beginning was a mixing of paints, and it came in. So if you view this mixing as the good and the bad, and pieces come off at points to be people, you've got mixtures of good and bad in differing quantities being there, but return to the same mix that occurred. So you can deal with good and bad and still sorry, just
that's
mental lapse.
No, that's a good analogy.
Isn't it, I mean, this might provide philosophical solace But isn't it fair to say that to most people in the here and now, the comfort would be if your consciousness still exists?
What do you think? I'll say what I think about it.
Well, maybe that's what we know, so we wanted to keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It might sound odd at a funeral to say, well, your dead loved one is was a drop in the ocean and now has returned to the cosmic goop.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I don't find this very comforting, this view personally, but that's my sensibility. Especially if there is something valuable about individuals. You know, if individuals are irreplaceable and each one's different, unique, and special, then to say, well, the individual's gone, but its energy has been returned to the big ocean. I like to think of it as like putting a drop of ink in a glass of water, and the ink just spreads all over. But it's no longer the drop. No longer has that glorious, very vivid color, but it's just diffused throughout the liquid. Yeah, I don't find that very comforting, because I don't even find that comforting about people. I don't find it comforting about animals even.
Right.
Like I would prefer to think that in some way, something about the individuality of, let's say, my dogs will be preserved. And it's not just that they'll decompose, or that their molecules will become nutrients for turnips, or that it's also not comforting to think, well, there will be other dogs. It was the special, unique features of those dogs that I like and love, and would be disturbed if that just disappeared from the universe in general. So that's what's behind this, I think, is how important is individuation, the specific qualities of individuals. If they're very, very important to you, then the survival of individuals beyond death should be something to be valued, rather than just we all return to the cosmic soup.
I find it, it's interesting that we as Christians have so many diverse views about this. It's such a critical part of our belief, life after death, that it's so undefined. And but it was interesting. I didn't really understand why we say rest in peace. And I was a Lutheran before I saw the light and saw it became a Presbyterian. That we're all going to, when we're resurrected, our physical bodies are going to be restored, and it's going to be a very crowded place in the cosmos that I understand and have experienced. But it almost seems like the idea of your soul existing in the cosmic soup, or whatever you call it, seems to make more sense, at least to me, here on Earth.
Yeah, you've articulated a theme that's been behind this whole series, which is that, and I'm going to speak for myself, I think this is what happens beyond death is a crucial question, and that any religion that doesn't deal with it head on is going to disappear. People are going to lose interest in it, because this is one of the big human questions. Why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing? Why was I born? Why is there anything? And what's going to happen beyond death? And my fear is that churches tend to dodge it and only talk about it on Easter, or maybe at funerals, or maybe when it's time to inscribe something on a tombstone. And the other big theme is there has never been a consensus in Christianity This is forcing me to ruin the cliffhanger and come to the big conclusion, which doesn't amount to much, which is it's all a mystery. And it's probably wise that the Bible did not go into detail about, as C.S. Lewis said, the furniture of heaven or the temperature of hell. Because it's all speculative, and once you try to figure it out, most of the views sound a little silly or strange or unsubstantiatable. So we're stuck with there are a variety of views. The Bible is open-ended about them, but it's a crucially important issue. So personally, I think the thing to do is to help people wrestle with the options and see which one speaks to them.
Even in the 21st century, we're saying in the Apostles' Creed, the resurrection of the body
Yes,
and the life everlasting.
yes.
And that certainly runs counter to many of the options that you're presenting
Yeah.
today. So
Yeah, the
how do
Apostles-
you reconcile that?
Right, yeah, the Apostles' Creed does come down on hard on the resurrection of the body part. But then it also has, and the life everlasting, which could be spiritual. So even there's an issue of which one do you want to stress. But yeah, we do have the Apostles' Creed and other creedal statements that are insistent upon the resurrection of the body. Yeah.
What about reincarnation?
Yeah, that's been a very, very minority view in Christianity, but it has occurred. And usually it involves the notion that we do have a spirit or a soul or something that can, as the technical term is, transmigrate, can move to another body, usually upon the person's death, but not have any memory of its prior existence. So in some sense, it's the same person, the same soul, but a different body and no memory of who it used to be. That's, of course, a major theme in most forms of Hinduism and in some forms of Buddhism. Rare in Christianity, but it has happened. There are Christians who have affirmed reincarnation, and these days probably more and more. Don't know why, but especially among young people, and young people in churches. If they're given, well, what do you believe about life beyond death, and they'll just say reincarnation. It has its attractions, because it means you should, in theory, although you can't remember them, learn from your past mistakes. Like your former life was a bust, but it left an impact on your character, and whether you can remember your misdeeds or not, your character is different, so you're less likely to do them again.
It's kind of as viable as any of the other options you gave us.
Yeah, right,
You know.
yeah. The only thing against it is that's the one for which there seems to be no biblical evidence. So folk are trying to be faithful to the Bible. That's the one over which there's no passage suggesting that, which doesn't necessarily mean it should be ruled out, but it's the least biblical of all of them. One thing I wanted to do is just quickly talk about something we touched upon last time, and that's universal salvation versus separation of the sheep and goats, versus damnation versus salvation. And and I won't resolve that one. Because both sides have something to say for it. For the universalism side, everybody will enjoy blessedness, eternity with God. The argument for it is that God, as revealed in Jesus, seems to be unconditionally loving and unconditionally forgiving. That Jesus tells people to love their enemies. So if humans are supposed to love their enemies, then presumably so does God. So that God continues to love God's enemies, including like Judas Iscariot, Adolf Hitler. And the next step in the argument is God's love is powerful. In fact, it's omnipotent. That God is not only loving, but also all-powerful. And therefore, beyond the grave, is it possible that anybody could resist the power of God's love forever? I mean, you might be able to pull it off for 80, 90 years on earth. But in eternity, won't God's love wear everybody down? And people will say, okay, I get it now. God loves me, I'm blessed, I'm saved, I'm happy. I had this just is a vague analogy. I might have said it before about the kid who followed me around in kindergarten. Okay, when I was in kindergarten, there was a creepy little kid who came up to me and said, "I'm your best friend." And I said, "No, you're not. Get away from me, you're creepy." And he followed me around. He'd follow me to the coat room to get my coat. He'd follow me to the bathroom. And he'd just keep saying, we are best friends. And I just kept saying, no. Finally, I just got so tired of it that I said, okay, we're best friends. And then actually a friendship did started to bloom. So what if eternity's like that? God's going to follow us around beyond the grave and just keep saying, I love you. And finally, we're going to give up and say, okay, I get it, you love me, I accept it. In which case, being loved, the recognition that you're loved by God is blessedness, is salvation, so that everybody will be saved eventually. Because nobody can withstand God's powerful, omnipotent love forever. That's the argument for universalism. And often it's based on an analogy with human parents. Is there anything, if you have a child, anything your child could do that would make you say, okay, we're done, I reject you forever and ever, and I hope you suffer. Parents aren't supposed to do that, and so neither would God. God wouldn't say, okay, my child, you've really ticked me off now, and you've gone over the line, and I can no longer be in relationship with you. So that's universalism, where it says, no, if God's love is unconditional, then it must embrace everyone. On the heaven and hell side of things, on the defense of the heaven and hell side of things is the notion that what we do in life should matter. And it should matter absolutely. So that if you are cruel, violent, abusive, unjust, hateful, you should experience the consequences of that. That actions should have consequences, and really, really bad actions should have eternal consequences. And conversely, virtuous actions of compassion, kindness, gentleness, justice should also be eternally preserved and rewarded. So, on the side of universalism is the theme and value of unconditional love. On the side of heaven and hell is, shouldn't our actions matter? And shouldn't they matter absolutely? So that there should be something like a final evaluation? So, my parting wisdom, I'm afraid if I don't have an answer, you will withhold the paycheck. But the final answer is this is mysterious. All we really know, and I'm going to speak as a Christian, is that whatever it is we're hoping for, it's going to be good. But that's the promise, that all tears will be dried, that all things will be well, so that all the things we hope for will be actualized beyond the grave. But what form that takes, we don't have a clue. And we can't have a clue, because we are finite creatures, bounded by space and time, bounded by the limitations of our own intellects, and even if God did reveal it, we probably wouldn't understand it. So I'm content to leave it as a mystery with the footnote that whatever it is, it's going to be good. So now, in our last 5 minutes, I don't mean last 5 minutes ever. Yeah.
I may not have the facts right, but isn't it the Seventh-day Adventists to believe heaven is going to be restricted to like a couple 100,000 people?
Yeah.
And is that based on virtue?
It's based on scripture where that number is mentioned once.
But how to get in there? Is that
Yeah.
virtue oriented?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You got to be a good person. Actually, you got to be a Seventh-day Adventist. Yeah. I think it's actually based on tithing.
Yeah, I pretty much echo what you said, that if you try to live the Christian life and knowing Jesus died for your sins, I just trust God that when I die, He'll take care of me and I don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Yeah.
I have a question. You hear people say they've had near-death experiences. Have people had consistent experiences, or they've differed with different people? Or is there any
They're
insight there?
different, and I've known some who have reported that. Some people who have had experiences of being outside, let's say they were being operated on and things had gone wrong and heart had stopped beating, being outside their body and looking at themselves, and then being pulled towards a light. So that seems to be a fairly common thing, that the notion of the, I was out of my body, and there was a light, and I was drawn towards it. And it was very peaceful and pleasant. No fear. Now, whether those are veridical experiences or are attributable to some sort of neurological phenomenon, no one knows. But the theme of going towards the light is common. And the experience of peace, and even disappointment that you had to go back.
From a practical standpoint, if one of your seminarians hears your lecture on this and goes through all these options when they're being ordained and speaking to the bishop or to the presbytery about their beliefs, is that acceptable today?
Generally, yes, unless it's a tradition that has a statement about this, that has in its confessional or creedal documents some statement about life beyond death that is supposed to be normative. So the Apostles' Creed is a good example. I mean, it would be possible for some denominations to say, let's say somebody's being examined for ordination, well, our denomination accepts the Apostles' Creed, and it says right there, resurrection of the body.
Yeah.
So do you believe in the resurrection of the body or not? And there are some denominations, or maybe some judicatories, that would say, yeah, you really got to affirm that, or else you're not one of us. That's becoming rarer and rarer as folk, I think, are more sensitive to the variety of themes in Scripture and how mysterious this whole thing is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't remember if there's any biblical basis in this, but is there a position in Christianity, saying that there is a life beyond, that there can be tangible communication between the two?
Oh, you mean communication with the deceased?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's rare and often discouraged, but there are Christian individuals and communities who will say that those who have departed can be contacted. In fact, at the seminary where I teach, in the 19th century, there was a famous, world-famous theologian. I'm not, but I'm not jealous or anything like that. But he, named John Nevin, whose adult son died in his later life. And then from then on, he went to seances and thought he could communicate with him. And that shocked most of his co-religionists, who thought that was just weird and maybe heretical. But yeah, there have always been Christians who thought that somehow or other the deceased could be contacted. Any other observations?
You know, I think I think it's from a Woody Allen movie in which he's agonizing to his family about, death and what happens. And they give him the line about, well, you live on, in your family and your works. And I think Woody Allen responds something about, but I want to be immortal by not being dead.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a plea for the survival of individual consciousness. Yeah. My other favorite Woody Allen quip was, eternal nothingness is probably okay as long as you're dressed appropriately. Well, thank you. I think we're about out of time.
Can you come back next week?
In body or in spirit.
Yeah, I'll be here in spirit.